Good evening, fellow humans. We are back again at the mirror point where reality is checking itself. And tonight we're going to have a debate night. So it'll be me and Stephen Hoyt, and I'll be bringing him on here momentarily to introduce. We're going to go through the debate in this format. We're going to do an opening, rapid fire question, open conversation, and then a closing. And we can do Q&A. If any of you guys have questions for me or Stephen after the debate, just go ahead and shoot them out there. And you can even join the stage. I'll put the link down at the bottom when it's all done. So if you want to join the stage and ask us in person, we can do it that way. Stephen, how you doing, my friend? Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me on. It's an interesting topic.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We're going to have a lot of fun. Our audience is going to definitely appreciate the different viewpoints we're going to bring to the table. This is going to be a collaborative effort to have a really upbuilding sort of conversation, although it is designed to be a kind of a debate. We'll let you guys at home decide what makes more sense for you, as you know how I feel about that. So we're going to go ahead and get this started. First of all, though, I want you to tell my audience a little bit about yourself, Steve, before we get going.
Software engineer professionally. I've been doing that for about 30 years now. Started out, been to 3 universities, and the first 2, I got right to the finish line and just decided to make a right turn. So originally I was going to be an art history teacher, area education, and then eventually got into computing the second round of college. It was great timing because that's when everything was just, if you knew some terms, the person that was hiring you didn't know anything. So employment was pretty good and the pay rate was good. So just kept up with all that for the past 30 years and trying to simplify people's lives by making programs that take care of things that are fairly mundane and open people's at least work lives into something more meaningful, hopefully.
Right.
Went back to college just in 2018, went back to Arizona State to finish what I had started. I didn't want to leave my education undone. And also looking towards retirement, I wanted something to have as a possibility to do after a professional career, maybe teaching at a university or something like that, or getting on having these kinds of discussions with interesting people on interesting subjects. So 2018, I went back to university for a degree in philosophy, still working at that time. And then took more hours than I needed to, but I wanted to get the academic recognition. So I ended up taking 56 hours, which qualified. And so graduated with a degree in philosophy, concentration in epistemology and theory of mind, and was successful at that and got highest honors and all that kind of stuff. So I haven't kept up with theory of mind. My baby all my life has been epistemology, and so that's where I spend a lot of my time and energy when I have the time to start thinking about philosophy and how things hang together. That's the that's the worthwhile stuff. The rest is, at least for your audience, the rest is just personal stories.
Oh, well, that's cool though. It means that you know you're an academic philosopher. You went to college, you got degreed, and this is really an honor to be challenged by someone who's in the know, who's a real philosopher. And so I do appreciate that. And so cool. So I tell you what, we're going to get right into it. And I think the way debates are set up, it's up to you if you want to start with an opening. I am making the positive claim. Usually the person making the positive claim is the one who starts. But it's up to you if you'd like to go.
Whatever you're comfortable with.
Okay. All right. So I've got mine written out. So I'm going to go ahead and read my opening. And we're going to make these openings about 5 to 7 minutes long, so we don't take too long, but enough time to really get our angle across, okay? Mm-hmm. All right, so idealism, an ideal idea. That's the what's on the table today. And so I think the first thing to do is define terms. That's the first thing I'd like to do. So idealism is a philosophical perspective asserting that reality is fundamentally mental or immaterial, with mind or phenomenal consciousness being the primary substance of existence. That's what the dictionaries or encyclopedia of philosophies will tell you. Now, there's different forms of it, of course. Key forms include like Platonic idealism, Cartesian dualism, Hegel's absolute idealism. What I'm arguing for is a natural, non-dual idealism. It doesn't require any extra realms of existence. It doesn't require the supernatural. It doesn't even require gods. It's just the view, reality to be completely in the realm of mental, in that category, not necessarily human mentation, not necessarily an animal consciousness, but what the philosophers call phenomenal consciousness, a very reflexive, neutral property, or not even a property, but a fundamental substrate by which opens the possibility for anything like an experience to be real in the universe. Consciousness or awareness is non-reducible to matter on this view. So let's go over some more terms here, because we'll be talking about these things. So again, I define consciousness as simply awareness, the quality of being and being like something. We don't have consciousness, we are conscious. We are consciousness. Consciousness is the most known thing to us primarily because this is what we are essentially. We are not our bodies or our titles or our roles or our names or any sort of narrative identification fundamentally. We are the experiencing of those things. Consciousness is accessible to us as a private, first-person, subjective knowing. Consciousness is the source of all knowing, all value making, all meaning, making, learning, and self-narrative. It's the condition for knowing anything at all, and for doing art, for doing abstract thinking, doing logic, and even science. All observation happens within consciousness. It is the epistemic ground for any knowledge claim or any knowledge at all, or worldview for that matter. It is the seat of reality for each and every one of us. On the other hand, we have this thing that I call the mind. And these two things, consciousness and mind, oftentimes get conflated. But on my view, the way that I'm using the word, the mind is the way consciousness is mediated locally within what a philosopher named Bernardo Kastrup would call a process of disassociation. The brain is the interface for channeling consciousness. It is the appearance of what we call a disassociation. The brain and embodiment is what consciousness appears to us as from a third person point of view. The embodiment is the portal into another person's consciousness, you may say. If you look into a mirror, you see your physical face, your eyes, your bone structure, et cetera, et cetera. But awareness and mental realities are not on that image you see in the mirror. That embodiment is a representation of an entire life experience. So the subjectiveness is internal, not on you. So when you perceive other people, you are kind of looking at the representation of a disassociated conscious awareness, another conscious being. The brain in the body is never about things. Only modes of consciousness, such as fears, belief, intentions, and ideas, are what the mind does, these modes. Brains and bodies appear within conscious awareness, but not outside of it. In the mind is what makes sense of these dichotomies and these distinctions. We produce language to reflect all of that stuff. Another term that's going to come up is physical. So what do I mean by physical? The physical is real. The physical is the regular, shared, stable patterns of what we experience, what behaves lawfully and independently of an individual will. So that's what I mean by physical. My problem isn't with the physical. My problem is with physicalism, that metaphysical sort of claim. Another thing that may come up is emergence. A lot of physicalists will talk about consciousness emerging from the brain. Well, there's two kinds of emergence we can talk about. One is weak emergence. That definition is this: high-level phenomena that are ultimately derivable from low-level interactions, but appear surprising or novel. Example could be like traffic jams, ant colonies, cellular automata, the computer simulations can track all of that. Those are examples of weak emergence. Strong emergence, on the other hand, is a high-level systemic properties that are not derivable or reducible from low-level features, regardless of computational power. You can't simulate it. Predictability, irreducible and fundamentally unpredictable from constituent parts. Examples of strong emergence are things like consciousness or quantum entanglement. And just to be clear, I don't accept strong emergence because we have no examples in real life other than claims about strong emergence. But I do accept weak emergence. We can trust weak emergence. The wetness of water, the fire triangle, all of these things are demonstratable within our experience. It works. Strong emergence, not so much. It's more of a theory, a model, a hypothetical. So I don't take it on as part of my belief systems. So consciousness coming from matter is frequently cited as a primary example of strong emergence. It suggests that mental phenomena like qualia, self-awareness, are all novel high-level properties that arise from complex neural interactions that are not conscious, but cannot be fully reduced to them or explained by them. They're just the physical laws governing individual neurons. And somehow this non-experiential matter, brain tissue, gives rise to consciousness, or this intangible aspect, this qualitative, subjective, first person reality that we all understand exists. That is strong emergence. But for me, it's like 0 equaling 3. You know, you can add 1 billion zeros to 0, you're still going to end up with 0. So essentially saying that something non-experiential evolving or emerging into something like an experience is like 0 equaling a billion, or something like that. So let's talk a little bit about disassociation. Well, I mentioned this in my opening a little bit already. It is the wall of separation between first-person experience and another's first-person experience, as an example. It is the inaccessibility of a local mind's ability to know anything outside of itself. This is not introducing anything new, by the way. All serious worldview models have the idea that one person cannot access another's subjective experience. A physicalist, for example, understands that her experience is not the same as mine, and that she can know what is going on directly in the Andromeda galaxy. She can't, and she understands that. It is a given that we have no direct access as human beings to things outside of mentation or experience. We are epistemically locked into private conscious experience. Physicalists will also agree that the mind is the product of a process of filtering information from the outside reality. So they would say that what we call reality is all in our heads, so to speak, as a perception. This is why we use tools in science to do our best to transcend our perceptual limitations that we have in many ways. And we've been able to do this in so many different ways. And this method of mathematical rigor and observation in quantum mechanics has demonstrated that reality is not as always intuitive as we assumed before these tools were available to us, right? Another thing we may talk about is, what is local realism? Local realism combines two assumptions here. Locality. That's no influence travel faster than light. Distant objects can't instantaneously affect each other because of that constraint. That's locality. Realism. Physical properties exist independent of observation. Measurement just reveals what was already there. So we have local realism that predicts certain limits, and we have the experiments that violate those limits. Then local realism would be false in that case. Not maybe false, but incompatible with the data. So what would this prove? Well, people assume the world had definite properties out there independent of observation. However, in 2022, a few years ago, local realism was challenged. A Nobel Prize was awarded to those who actually challenged it and proved that there were no definite properties out there independent of observation. And we have the Liggett's experiments that prove the same for physicalism. That assumption is no longer tenable if you also want locality. Now, let me be clear, this does not prove idealism at all. It just debunks certain assumptions that physicalism entails. And so I think it's pretty important to bring this stuff up if we're going to use science in any sort of capacity or have it as a guide in any way. So the classical picture of local observer independent reality is incomplete, and in principle, local realism cannot be true if we take science seriously. So the conclusion is, since the only way we can know anything is through consciousness, it seems like it should be the ground of my epistemology. To doubt agency would require agency to do so. If physicalism is defined as reality is fundamentally that which is an abstraction within consciousness, then physicalism is less parsimonious on that view. If physicalism creates a hard problem of consciousness for showing how consciousness can in principle emerge from the brain, then it invokes a magical leap to explain consciousness where idealism starts with consciousness. If the physical sciences show that the classical idea of a fully observer independent local physical world could never be correct in principle, then it seems that idealism at least presents a coherent alternative view. And so with that, I think I'll end it right there, and I'll hand it on over to Steve.
Well, enjoyed that. Thanks for the definitions, and I'll try and be a good custodian of everybody's time, either by keeping this brief or at least meaningful, where people don't start falling asleep if we go too long. So the first part, I'm always, we got the two parts with the questions and answers and our responses, and then this brief opening. Both of those together I plan taking on maybe 10 to 12 minutes to do. So I'm also going to read mine. Used to do this all the time, and I'm out of practice. It's been about 7 years. So I'm going to try and improve the quality of my communication by just having the ideas prepared, and I'm going to read them to you, and then we can be more organic as things go.
Okay.
But I think before we ask the question of whether or not idealism is true or an ideal idea, we need to ask prior questions, like what would count as a good philosophical answer here? So not just one that is internally consistent, many systems are, and not one that just feels satisfying. Many stories do that too. But one that earns its explanation, one that doesn't make the hardest parts of reality disappear too easily. Because if we don't get that right, then we may end up rewarding the wrong kinds of answers. And that's a common assumption that philosophy is supposed to settle things, to give us a final stable picture of reality. But historically, that's just not what philosophy does. At best, philosophy does something more demanding. It clarifies, it sharpens, and most often it unsettles. And that hopefully is where we lead this conversation, is with two of us presenting different ideas and questions and observations and difficulties, and your audience and both of us have to encounter the subject, and it's meaningful enough, hopefully, for us both for all of us to revisit all these things, have an interest, and go out and look into things a little more, just to invite curiosity. That's my hope here. But philosophy shows us where intuitions break down, exposes tensions that we didn't notice. It keeps certain questions open, not because it's failed, but because the subject itself resists early closure. So I'm not going to ask you to choose the view that feels more complete. I'm going to ask you to consider which view handles difficulty honestly. When we just start with a few quiet checks, we might want to keep in mind. First is, if a theory leaves us feeling like the world has become almost unsurprising, then we might want to pause and ask whether something important has been explained or just set aside. And the second thing is, there's a difference between explaining something and redescribing it in new terms that feel more unified. And sometimes a theory sounds deeper because it uses more general language, but hasn't really increased our understanding. And the third thing is, some features of reality, especially the fact that we have experiences all, seem to resist easy assimilation into any framework. And I think this is one of those. And as far as really exploring how consciousness could arrive scientifically from physical standpoint, we're very naive, operating off of a lot of assumptions. It's rescued somewhere else other than the fact that we have a complete model of something that doesn't have any problems. It's got problems, and we're going to talk about those. But what we're looking for is an explanation based on observations that we do have and things that are hard to explain without a physicalist view. But a serious philosophy should meet that resistance, not to dissolve it by definition, not to redeclare it or declare it handled simply because it fits within some system. In other words, philosophy at its best doesn't remove the difficulty of reality. It prevents us from removing it too quickly. So with that in mind, consider idealism for a second. It's an elegant view. What you said is put together well, and there's a cohesive picture that you're painting. It tells that at the core of reality, everything is mental, and that we can call the physical world, in some sense, depends on mind. And there's a kind of unity to that, a kind of coherence, which, that's one of the things that makes for elegant philosophy. But we have to, again, it's got to earn some kind of meat, to bring more meat to the table than just coherence. So instead of two fundamentally different kinds of things under idealism, which would be mind and matter under physicalism, you get with idealism that there's just one thing. There's, at the core of everything is mind, and then these things that we call real or physical, or some kind of product from that. And so that's kind of a nice straight line theoretical way to get rid of some problems. We have to ask, well, whether or not it does, or if it maybe proceeds a little bit too quickly. So it's easy to see the appeal of that kind of simplicity. But the question we should keep in front of us is not just whether the view is elegant, it's whether the elegance reflects some explanatory success, or whether it arrives by making certain difficulties less visible. So when we say everything is ultimately mental, have we explained what matter is? Or have we reclassified it in a way that feels unified without increasing our grip on understanding reality? When we can account for experience by saying the reality itself is experiential, we've solved the problem. We have to ask if we've solved the problem of consciousness, or just shifted it to a different level. So these aren't objections so much as questions about the appropriate, getting to appropriate responses to the problem that's in front of us. Is reality fundamentally mind? Because a view can be internally coherent, even beautifully so, it still leaves the question open of whether it has deepened our understanding. And compare that with physicalist approaches. Physicalists say ultimately reality is physical. But here's the important part. It does not currently give us a satisfying account of why conscious experiences exist at all. That's a real gap. But notice what it doesn't do. It doesn't make that problem disappear. It leaves it in full view, as unresolved and even stubborn. So it's at least worth asking whether preserving a genuine difficulty is sometimes a sign of intellectual progress rather than failure. And so the question isn't just which view is more coherent, it's which view meets reality at its most difficult points without smoothing them over. So because the better philosophy may not be the one that settles the question, but the one that keeps the question alive without collapsing into confusion and without giving answers faster than reality allows. So there's the opening for us to think about consciousness together tonight. And that's, I know it's a debate format, but it's the togetherness of us asking these kinds of questions that will increase some understanding and not have any other kind of intent or outcome. So I hope the upshot is that people are interested in the subject, and we give them something to think about. That's open.
Okay, perfect, man. I really like that. I really like that a lot. And that's really the spirit of the channel. Hopefully people get from that, is that I always like to say, I don't know what the truth is. I don't know whether idealism's the real answer. I just can argue for it a little better than I can argue for its alternatives. But I want a steel man just to be the guy that's being the pro idealist guy, just so we can have it on the table. And hopefully I give the strongest arguments for that view. So I can steel man the idealist view. Hopefully someone can steel man the physicalist view. Whether you believe this is the case or not, doesn't really matter. The whole point is to put ideas out on the table, explore them together, pick them apart if we can, and, do everybody justice by letting them be aware of what these views are. So on our second part here, we're going to go into the rapid fire questions. What this means is that we ask questions and we just give our answer without any sort of, bloviation or follow up or anything like that. And we just move right on to the next question, and we'll save the deep digging and exploration into the open conversation, which is next. So I have my questions here, but I know that now Steve is going to answer all of my questions with one particular answer. So I think maybe you should go ahead and start and ask me, because I'll answer them one at a time. And then I'll ask you what my 4 or 5 questions that I had, and then you can just answer those all at once.
Okay.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And I'm going to try and keep the background on the questions I have were off the top of my head 2 days ago. The things that I think about when I think about idealism and why it typically in the academic world is not the prevalent view. And that aside, these are the things that really keep me up at night if I start thinking about is idealism true or is physicalism true? But I'm just going to try and reference each one back to points that you talked about in your opening. And
okay.
One of them was your commenting that we have first-person access to our consciousness, and that's it. And to leave out several steps, the ultimate path that you go down that I don't think the path explains is how you get from there to consciousness. But from that consciousness itself is fundamental to everything. It can be primary or fundamental to how humans think or how we make epistemic judgments or things like that. But the distinction I wanted to bring up first was knowing that through the mind doesn't entail everything being made of mind. Is that something that you agree with or no?
Yes, I agree with that. That is all true. This is just a description of my epistemology where I start from. So true. But all knowledge of the physical is mediated by your experience of it. So materialism infers an unknowable substrate beyond experience called the physical. And idealism just stays within what is actually a known given. So I want to build my epistemology on something we can all agree on, that we can know. And it seems like the only thing I really know with any really high degree of certainty is that I'm having this experience of existing. And so I think that should be the start of my epistemology.
Okay. And then the second would be the observation, epistemic access is not the same as ontological structure.
Agreed.
Yeah. Okay.
Agreed. But ontology should be grounded in what is epistemically accessible. Otherwise, you're positing a reality in principle which is disconnected from any possible knowledge.
Okay. Maybe we can bring the epistemic thing back up. I halfway agree with you, but there may be some edge cases that are indirect that might still give you warrant for different beliefs. But again, circle back. So consciousness, I don't think consciousness may be any clearer a foundation than physical. And part of that is because the only kind of consciousness that I know of firsthand is human consciousness. And I see that when humans have brain damage or they're under anesthesia, there is the mind and consciousness with it seems to supervene on the physical, which means that if there are changes in physical states, then the mental states also follow, which is a good implication that there's a link between the two, and it's in one direction. We, under those kinds of considerations, it implies strongly that it's one direction, but there doesn't need to be any kind of laws where we have thoughts, a mental life that actually affects our physical self or in part in reality. So I'm not clear. Do you think that it does? And if you do you think it offers a clearer foundation, and why?
So yeah, I think your question was consciousness is maybe no clearer than physical.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking you mean that it's known just as vaguely or clearly as consciousness, I suppose. Well, consciousness,
A rock, for instance.
uh-huh.
I can't really imagine a kind of thing a rock would be compared to what I mean by the thing that I experience, which is consciousness. I don't know what it would mean for a rock to be conscious. That's the kind of problem I'm wrestling with there.
Mm. Well, I guess maybe I've misunderstood, but I would say consciousness is directly known. So physical is sort of like an inferred abstraction from measurement. So while one is the given consciousness, the other is a model. So they're not epistemically symmetrical, I guess is what I would say on that. But as far as the correlation, I accept that the two are correlated. And even in neuroscience, this is the case, that there is no scientific pronouncement that the brain causes consciousness, it's always understood. It's called the neural correlates of consciousness. They call it the NCC, but not one neural conscious model of correlation is explained. There's no theory to explain why there's a correlation or why is that tight correlation there. There's no theory for that. No one can explain even one conscious experience. All you can really do is measure brain activity against reports, against what people say they're experiencing at any time. And I just grant that as an idealist or really anybody, I think you can reasonably grant that. No one in any sort of philosophical view would deny that. And so I don't see the one direction that you may be speaking of. I see that it's an open question. It's what we're questioning now, you know.
Okay. I'll let that one go. There's a lot to chew on there. I get really, I have an aversion to people generalizing within a specialized field about what research is in that dialectic, what ideas are being engaged in that dialectic, and how popular or broad that is. Like, I have really high standards for that. I am in that field, and I don't generally, unless I know from some kind of study, I try to stay away from making generalizations like that. But I will say the vast majority of philosophers don't see that problem or physicalism as it has problems, but some 60% of academic philosophers ask the question whether or not it's idealism or some other theory than physicalism. They will tell you it's physicalism. That's not going to get us anywhere, though. We should think what we think because we've got good reasons to, and popularity is not a good reason. But it is a field in which the work has been done to justify why it is, or can explain why it is that the people spending the majority of their time and effort in their career to align themselves with the theories and ideas that are easiest to defend, why they've landed on physicalism. So there's a difference between arguing to popularity and then having a research base that can explain why an idea is popular versus the idea is popular, or the idea is right because it's popular. That sort of thing. But that's something we can come back to. I would just I'm cautioning about making generalizations within a specialized field. Anyway, if this is more, it's still related to the does the idea of consciousness is it any clearer than physical? So replacing one unclear term with a broader one isn't necessarily an explanation. So I'm wondering if you are an idealist for good reasons, and you can have perfectly logical ones too. And you've laid out a great case for it. So that's one task. But what I'm really curious about in bringing this observation up is, what good does it do? How does it advance our understanding? Can we make predictions from it? Or what do we do with this idea? Even if we just grant that it's true, what does it do for us?
So yeah, replacing an unclear term really isn't an explanation. So idealism isn't replacing terms. It's really just sort of reversing the explanatory direction. So instead of deriving mind from matter, it's deriving matter from experience, which is based on what we actually know, which is our experience. So that's kind of the idea behind idealism. And I know that there's a lot to unpack with that. We'll get into that, but that's my quick answer to that question.
Well, yeah, so that explains why a car has an engine. What I'm asking is, so we've got cars with the engine in the front, and you think it's a good idea to put it in the back. Those aren't like random decisions. We don't just do that for no reason. What I'm asking is, if you put the engine in the back of the car, what does it get us by building cars that way? Like, what does the idea actually get us?
Well, by reversing direction, well, first of all, it would sort of it would make sense of the hard problem. Like, if you look at, like, the way that I look at the hard problem of consciousness is, for me, it very well could be just a limitation in our concepts, so that the hard problem really isn't a real problem. It could be the case that it's only a problem when you assume materialism, because then you've got the hard problem of explaining, as you also agreed to, that physicalism is challenged by, to explain how that happens. How is it that there's a conscious reality other than just hand waving strong emergence? Is there any other way that we can get to that? Now, there's other sort of explanations like panpsychism, which would say that, hey, within every little atom or subatomic particle, there's a little consciousness. There's a little piece of consciousness embedded in that fundamental quantum field, or whatever, however you want to say it. And so when you just combine all those atoms and subatomic particles in a really neat, nifty way, out pops consciousness. So if you go into the brain and you start messing with the neurons, of course, you're going to change your quality of experience, and the evidence supports that. So it's one explanation, but that one has its own problems. Idealism also has its own problems, like to explain matter. It's like a reverse, right? But at least we can explain mind, on this particular model. How do we explain the material world? Well, idealism says that there are appearances within a greater mind, a greater sort of what you could call it, a potential for all experiences to happen, to occur within. Again, we're talking metaphysics. If you're asking for like a scientific proof of it, I don't know. What's the benefit of looking at it that way? Well, it dissolves the hard problem of consciousness. It also lends itself to non-duality. And there's a whole lot of benefits towards a non-dual view in the world. A lot of this is emotional reasons. A lot of these could be just analytical, just good analysis, just finding coherence, comparing one model against another. And so it has that sort of appeal to it. So it really, as you say, it sort of boils down to what you're trying to really solve in your personal view. What really interests you, and what are you really trying to figure out? And for me, the idea of consciousness is just not satisfactorily answered, even in principle, under materialism, while it is through idealism. It treats consciousness as a fundamental. And it seems that If we can look at other non-reducible things like spin, charge, quantum fields, time, space, if we can look at these things as possibly irreducible fundamental properties, well, consciousness seems to possibly be one of those things. Instead of going the route of trying to explain consciousness in terms of other things, why can't consciousness just stand on its own? Maybe it's just a fundamental feature of reality. It's part of being, that there's something that it's like to be this form or that form in the universe. And it's just part of the way it is. And in that way, it's fundamental.
Okay. I'm going to try and make one more distinction in that. And I'm just going to ask one more question. I have a list of, I don't know, at least 15. But I want to focus in on that again. And I want to make sure that I have you right. Because what it sounded like interested you most about idealism is that the instrumental value, the bang for the buck that you get, is there is a theory of physicalism which has certain problems with it. Mm-hmm. And if you adopt this view, then that one problem goes away because you have another view. So that it does give us instrumental value in that term. And then you had also implied that it has other philosophical implications on maybe how we consider things like quarks and spin and all the fun stuff. What I'm not trying to explain is anything in academic terms. What I'm trying to understand is the way reality is. Part of that reality includes consciousness, and I'm trying to understand how it emerges or came to be, if that's a better term. If it just came from physical things, then how do we get here? It's pretty hard to answer, but it's also a really interesting question, which is what philosophers love. I don't love it as much as most other people because I am not ready to spend the kind of time in the naive position that we're all in right now. I'm glad there are other people that do. But what I was looking for there was not just how it resolves academic questions. I'm giving an example. In the application of the philosophical idea of brains producing minds and minds producing consciousness, we make certain predictions, and under the different lab conditions and tests and seeing whether or not a hypothesis from that idea becomes a theory. It's got a super good warrant for it. We can get all that through physicalism. We have been getting that through physicalism. Even as naive as we are about neuroscience, we've only just developed where we can actually scan the brain in lifetime. We're even with that kind of limited experience in technology, we are still getting non-academic bang for our buck. We can do things through this theory. We can understand the world in a different way that has consistent, usable ramifications for adopting it, not just in theory. Makes academic problems less problematic. But so that's kind of where I was going. Maybe we explain that later. I'm going to bypass the rest of the questions I have except for one. And I'm going to hope that it's one that resonates with other people. So the question is, why is reality stable and law-like and mathematically structured and very resistant to what we think about it? Our conscious experience is often in direct contrast with what's out there, and multiple, not just an individual, multiple people experience the world in the same way. And these are all private, but there must be something out there. And whether or not we're all judging, making judgments on, well, why is the world the way it is? And because it's the way it is, that's the explanation of why we all experience it very similarly. even when we're doing exactly what you say. We can only make judgments from this firsthand. Without consciousness, we can't have the discussion. We can't make theories. We can't make judgments, those kinds of things. Even though that's true, still leaves us with the gap between, does this epistemic problem or an access problem mean that there's not a world out there that has nothing to do with mind? And that's the difficulty that I have to get around. The what we're calling the physical world seems to operate in an ordered way, but not at any kind of level where my being in the world matters to it in a fundamental way. Like the laws of physics are not going to change whether I observe something or whether I don't. That may have different implications when I, the classic wave pattern when you're observing a electron being fired singly, or you leave it alone. And anyway, wave, particle, that old discussion, that may be true, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I have to observe something for the laws to exist. And the laws may be not just necessary for the kind of world that we experience, but it also may be sufficient for everything to have everything the way it is, exactly as the way it is. It may be sufficient for that too. So that's kind of my question to you is why is reality seem to be indifferent and governed by something not like my conscious involvement in it?
I would hate to do this, but I would probably answer the same way of physicalists would, or materialists. That's just how reality is. Some things, the one thing about the human mind is it's limited. Our perceptions are limited. Our ideas are limited. We're always wrong. We're always shifting paradigms. We're always shifting our knowledge. We're growing in knowledge. Sometimes it's in fits and starts or whatever. So there's enough evidence, I think, if we take our experience in memory serious, then we can see that our minds are limited. And so we're not going to have direct access to, the noumena. We're kind of stuck in the phenomena of the world. And so the best we do with the best we can with it, we try to build an epistemology on the known rather than some made up thing, like, some out there world we have no access to, whether that be God's, the flying spaghetti monster or whatever.
Can I interrupt you real quick?
Yep.
So what's your response is hedged in epistemic language, and what I'm trying to say is there is a structure in reality. It's mathematics can describe it. It's law-like. Reality is stable, and it's stable no matter who's observing it. At least the laws seem to be. And what governs reality does not seem like it requires consciousness at all. So it's not like we can both say that we're just going to make an assumption that, or just say starting point, that's just the way things are. Because it's an active choice to go from observing what we observe and verifying, going through all the rigor that science does to say, this isn't just a good idea. It's getting us somewhere. We're understanding things better, and we continue to build off of it as a consistent trajectory. And it doesn't have to do with our wanting to have things be that way. That's the way it turns out on the physicalist view, which is why it's really hard to get someone to change their mind about things. So what I'm trying to get at with that question is, what kind of path is there for idealism to get to that starting point to say, this explains why, here are the reasons why we should assume that beyond these physical laws and reality, that it all starts in some way fundamentally with mind, because it doesn't seem like that's required to take us from a beginning of the universe to explanations of how planets came from gases and gravity, and life had the opportunity and chance to emerge, and it did, and then conscious being, that whole thing. You can at least build physical models that can be tested and on all that kind of stuff. So I don't know how you would go about it. Yeah, certainly you can say, well, if I take it for granted that everything is fundamentally mental, well, it has to, in order to provide an explanation, it has to be a consistent thing that makes a difference in all your propositions that are built on it. So that's the epistemic side of it, but it's also it's an ontological problem. How do you come to know that it's mental, other than making that choice that mentality is the fundamental nature or behind the bedrock of everything else, minds and matter?
Well, again, not to repeat over and over, maybe I'll approach it this way. And just to let everybody in the audience know, idealism is not promoting the idea that it's our personal mind. So that's kind of a common misunderstanding. I just want to kind of put it out there. Reality is not governed by our thoughts, okay? Idealism rejects this. So your personal mind, like I said, is limited, and reality follows rules that we never choose. We can be surprised. The governing principles of the universe, or whatever we want to call it, is transpersonal. It's not individual, right? So we look at the core idea in idealism is what we call structured consciousness. So idealism would say that reality sort of equals experience structured by consistent constraints, okay? So these constraints sort of function like laws of physics, mathematical regularities, patterns, things like that. But instead of being laws of matter, we're just saying that they're laws of how experience is organized. So it's just the switching of the same thing. So there's different versions of what governs reality, right? So this is kind of going back to people like Hegel, that says like reality is governed by an absolute or universal mind. Individual minds are expressions of it. Laws that you talk about are like internal consistency of that mind, right? So now we get into like more modern sort of flavors of idealism, like analytic idealism, sort of associated with Bernardo Castro. He would like to say something like, reality is governed by impersonal structures of consciousness, right? Not necessarily a quote unquote God, but more like a field of mind with inherent rules, like, something law-like, something that's the condition for which any sort of experience of a physical world could arise. Why does reality feel external and fixed? Well, even in idealism, you can't walk through walls, right? Fire still burns, gravity still works. And this is because reality is governed by the constraints beyond your will. And these appear as what we call external physical laws. But on idealism, these are regularities in the structure of experiences. So why would you ask, like, why laws exist at all? So materialism would struggle with, why does matter obey laws, right? Idealism would answer, well, laws are intrinsic to how mind or experience is structured. So order is expected, intelligibility is expected, right? So you could say, like, under idealism, reality is governed by stable, impersonal structures of consciousness that sort of constraint or impose consistent constraints on experiences. What we call laws of physics, these are not external to experience, but inherent to it. You know what I mean? So reality isn't governed by matter, it's governed by the rules of experience itself.
There's a lot to chew on there. Well, we should circle back around to that. Like I said, I'm going to leave the rest of the questions alone, because discussion should be pretty interesting with all we've covered so far. So you had 7 questions. I don't know if you want to read those questions. What I plan to do, one thing that is usually on people's minds when a physicalist will get up. The opportunity arises for us to talk about idealism because there's that gap of how do you get from purely physical matter to consciousness and meeting all the other things. How do you get there from the starting ingredients of physical laws and virtual particles becoming matter, that kind of thing. So what I'm going to try and do is give common naturalistic account of how at a high level look, how we might have arrived here, being conscious, having this conversation, and at the same time address the questions that you had in that explanation, kind of.
Okay. So for the audience sake, I could just ask the questions and kind of lay them out, what the question means. It's real brief, as you know, and then I'll give you the floor and let you just go on to answer all of those wrapped up in your presentation, if we can do it that way.
Yeah, it's perfect.
All right. So I'll go ahead and get started on that. So my questions were pretty basic. So it goes into the hard problem of consciousness. How do purely quantitative physical processes produce qualitative experiences like the redness of an apple or pain? My other question was the explanatory gap. Even if we were to map brain states to experiences, how does that correlation become identity? The other question was conceivability. It was a conceivability challenge. Can you conceive of a physically identical world with no consciousness? Like a philosophical zombie, you could say. And if yes, how are they identical? Then we have the access problem. If the physical world exists independently of experience, how do you verify it without using experience itself? Then we have the model versus reality problem. If physics describes reality itself, or is it just modeling of observations? If they're just models, how do you justify turning them into an ontology or a metaphysic? Then we have the circularity issue. We use observations to prove a physical world, but observations already assume consciousness. How is that not circular? Are you assuming what you need to prove? If all evidence is accessed through consciousness, how do you justify claiming that something outside consciousness is more fundamental? And I'll just kind of leave it there and bring him back on stage.
Cool. So yeah, this is what I'm going to propose. That consciousness is an evolved control architecture. It increases decision efficiency in organisms operating over high dimensional affect-laden predictive models. And I'll be happy to put this in more layman's terms later, but I'm just going to get through it for now. So emotions compress decision space via embodied valuation, while consciousness integrates and globally broadcasts these valuations, enabling flexible prioritization under complexity and uncertainty. The standard philosophical objections, the hard problem, the explanatory gap, conceivability, and epistemic circularity arise from treating consciousness as something to be derived from independently specified physical ontology. On that framing is methodologically inverted. So brains, bodies, and the physical world are not accessed independently of experience. They are theoretical posits within predictive models constructed from structured regularities in experience. Physics, therefore, is best understood not as the direct description of mind-independent reality, but as an increasingly compressed, intersubjectively validated model of those regularities. From this perspective, the so-called explanatory gap reflects a category error. So it attempts to explain qualitative experience in terms of abstractions that were themselves derived from experience. Likewise, conceivability arguments, philosophical zombies, exploit a looseness in our conceptual models, not a demonstrated metaphysical possibility. I've heard an example of, you can imagine a Boeing 777 flying backwards. Doesn't mean it's actually possible. What I can conceive and what is actually possible are often not connected at all. Whether or not consciousness is one of those kinds of things is an open question, especially where we're at right now with what we know and what we can measure in any kind of appreciable way, or verify, or any of the other epistemic norms we'd like to follow. We're not exactly there yet. Anyway, consciousness doesn't need to be produced by quantitative processes. Rather, quantitative descriptions are higher order abstractions over the qualitative field in which all evidence appears. So the relevant scientific question is not how experience arises from the physical, but how increasingly efficient predictive control architectures, organization differentiate and utilize experience for adaptive behavior. So consciousness is both functionally indispensable as a coordination mechanism over effective inference, and epistemologically primary as a medium within which any claim about reality includes physics is formulated and justified. So we can imagine that when in our evolutionary course of events, we develop the ability to recognize patterns, and then we might have the development of certain behaviors. Nothing conscious, just we have these a tendency when we see a certain pattern. Let's say a fly, you start to smack it, might not have any decision making at all. It just has a quirk about its brain mechanism where it will fly backwards as soon as you swat at it, and you're not going to kill it. So that behavior is itself just a primary basic thing that's baked into every fly that survives by having that same trait. Pattern recognition is very expensive. What tends to happen in nature is that economy wins. So the more rich the brain processing that goes on, let's say we recognize and associate many different kinds of backgrounds, patterns. And then we have to, based on the more models or the more matches we have, similar situations, we've just got to start making choices about what we do in those situations. That's very expensive without having a shortcut. And what may be some of the first shortcuts are the development of emotions, so that we have just a few instances that point to a pattern that exists. And we've put a bookmark on those before based on, did it cause pain? Did it later, when you get a more rich set of emotions than very basic ones, then did it cause me joy? Was it pleasurable? Those kinds of things. So now you've reduced the workload on the brain, and you've stubbed decision making primarily down to this emotion. When you have that, also frees up your brain to make all kinds of other decisions about the world, recognize new different patterns. It frees up, so it's an economy of things. But when you get as your emotional base, these bookmarks that help us make decisions, as it gets broader, you need some kind of mechanism that they're going to come in conflict. In one case, you might have a priority on this one or another one. They're competing. You need some kind of structure that manages that. And ultimately, as that gets more rich and our ability to take in more information and have the need to stub those too. You might need something that manages the prioritization, and being conscious could be a way in which that all gets managed, and it gets to a complexity level where not just basic emotions there, but ideas like fulfillment. Why are we in relationships? Well, fulfillment. What is meaning that you get from work? We might suffer some of those things that we would have avoided before if we can now project into the future. We've got that ability to, and then what we would like out of that future, and then what as a result of wanting to go that trajectory, we've got to make decisions. And these are all shortcutted, but it seems like it could come from just the basic formation of a way to free up brain power to give prompt responses that are largely appropriate. And then those can, if that's successful, it can expand to more rich set of emotions. And then the more rich they get, the more likely you're going to need some kind of management of those, some kind of way to coherently hold those intentions and make decisions that you want to make. And the wanting to make something a certain way is a primary function of conscious creatures like us. So it's a rough shot at trying to answer your question, and also at the same time trying to explain how we might have gotten to be conscious creatures just from physical stuff.
Thank you so much, man. I love that. Hold on. Whoa, I'm sorry. There we go. Yeah, love that, man. I agree with everything you said, 100%. Like, I love it, man. In fact, I'm going to put a link in here. There's a really good video. It's called Conversations with Nick Rollo, Some Thoughts on the Mind as Material. And he goes into a lot of that functional stuff you were talking about, even some of our behaviors actually being, and not even just with human brains, but even with individual neurons for mice, or even for single cell amoeba, things like that, that there are certain behaviors that happen quite reflexively, based on information that you kind of sort of pack away unconsciously. So that a lot of what we say and do are just the result of information that we're not even conscious of, that goes into our minds, and our neurons sort of make use of that information in order to make those quick snap decisions, which he was saying that in an evolutionary perspective, you can see how useful that could have been to even a human on the savannah trying to make decisions about where to get food, where to get this, where to get that. I mean, a lot of this stuff, we make decisions on the fly. We don't even know how we do it. Even the words that are sort of falling out of my mouth right now, they're not premeditated. This stuff, my subconscious is drawing from everything I've ever learned, anything I've ever experienced, all the habits I've formed, stuff like that. And there's a very natural use for it. There's definitely an advantage in all of these sort of things. So I guess we'll go into the open discussion. With all of that, I wouldn't disagree. The only thing I would point out is that I'm still kind of stuck there. Like, function doesn't equal identity. You're talking about a lot of things I already agree on and I'm fascinated with, by the way.
So what do you mean by identity, Scott?
We're talking about consciousness, identifying the cause of consciousness, or what materialists would say it generates from matter, right? How do we identify that? Just by looking at functionality rather. I understand it's important, but I'm just not sure how that gets us to that question, right? Like function feels like an explanation, but maybe it's not really. It's like people confuse correlation, like brain activity tracks experience with identity or explanation. Brain activity is experiencing all of that, but tracking something is not explaining why it exists in the first place, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, so it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like you're taking up a way of objecting that others have, where if I have something in mind, like I'm picturing a bird inside my mind, that if we were to crack my skull open, we ought to be able to find that bird somewhere that I'm thinking about it. Or if we track the right particular neurons that was supposed to be producing it, we'd be able to see how that bird was put together or something like that.
Well, I don't think materially, it would probably be unfair for me to paint physicalists with a broad brush and say, oh, they think that triangles or shapes or words or stuff are literally inside your brain. I don't think anyone really says that. I think everybody's sort of in agreement that you roughly represent something. Even what we remember is not really the thing that we think we're remembering. I agree with all that. I think that we have some sort of representation that does appear to us as something that we call, like when I'm out in Walmart, I always lose track of my car, right? And but I always find my car. And it's because my mind has a representation of what my car looks like. So I know that in my mind, there's this thing I call car, and it's my car, and I know how to identify it. It's good enough. But I would think that you could print out like a photo of what I'm thinking about. I think that's science fiction. Like, I don't think that, like, there's a lot of folks that I talk to that think you can actually do that science can actually, you think of something and it will print out what you're thinking about. And I don't think it works that way. I know what they're referring to, but it doesn't work that way. And the reason it doesn't work that way is because this sort of dimension of thinking and imagining, this mental life, is not the same category as the physical properties that correlate with it. That's the problem. We have a problem there. We have a gap that's really there. And, and so I understand also too, just to kind of point to, I should probably point this out as well, is I don't even expect science to tackle this problem. I really don't, at least modern science. I don't expect that. There was a recent interview my friend Alex had with Dr. Jeffrey Yosham. He leans more towards physicalism, but he's a neuroscientist. But he sort of presented a paper that he calls the metaphysical neutrality in cognitive science, that it doesn't really tell you what direction anything is. It doesn't even concern itself with it. It's not, and that's part of his problem with idealism. It's like, who cares? Nobody in science is caring about that. Nobody worries about where does conscious, even if you could find the answer, what difference does it make? What would it do for the science?
If
functionalism,
Yeah. So to bring it back a few steps. So when you talk about identity, you're not talking about like the sense of self or anything. You're talking about where's the locus of consciousness in
Correct.
the mind. Okay. So, okay. You're a computer guy. So my next question is, AI is not conscious. Can you explain how it does pattern recognition and can be basically right now some versions of different AI could count as philosophical zombies, but it would be sufficient to give that impression that they were intelligent, even though we can right now say that they are not conscious, and we can locate every bit of where memory's stored. We map, because we designed it this way, how it does pattern recognition, all the underlying stuff. That's the locus part of the epistemic gap that we have. It's not necessarily an ontological problem, but is an epistemic one. But in this case, in the case of AI, we definitely know all the structures and all the But what we don't know, and this is the important part, is what decisions it's going to make, because it will make very good ones that surprise us. And we had great examples in the a few years back with the game of Go. It was winning against grandmasters, one of the hardest games to play, very abstract, and it was making novel moves no one expected. And with all of the programming in place, knew exactly how it worked and all that, still couldn't figure out epistemically what was going on that made it make these brilliant winning strategies. So it seems to me that we lack that part of human consciousness where we know exactly how everything is working. That's an epistemic gap.
Yes.
But then we have the behavioral part of that, where even if we knew that, we still might not know that something's conscious. It's just we have just awesome decision making. So for me, the importance of consciousness is what role does it play, what meaningful role does it play in biology? Because as far as I can tell, best I can justify, consciousness is tied to biology. It doesn't seem like it's fundamental. Let me put it this way. When I talk about minds and when I talk about consciousness, I always think of biology. I don't think of rocks, and it seems intuitively absurd to think that the fundamental thing that makes up a rock is conscious structures. It seems like it's an extra step that's not needed. It's still having that structure in place still doesn't tell me what a rock is like and what we can do with it, the properties that it has and why it has it. It doesn't make any accessible path to making useful predictions or any kind of, it just sits there as an idea for me. So that's the gaps seem to be, at least for me, epistemic largely. And I shouldn't be surprised that there are huge epistemic gaps right now, because this entire field of study is new with the kind of approaches that we're taking, that we're able to take at this point in time in history to even start having a meaningful conversation. Before, it's been largely just one theory talking to another theory, and people have different preferences, and the one's view is coherent. It's just a lot of epistemic norm throwing at things. And that kind of game, language game, for me is just not something I'm interested in. But it's this intuition that I have that I don't really have a good reason to think that it makes a difference whether or not the constituents, the basic foundation or principles or whatever it is that gives me a rock, whether it's consciousness or physical, I don't care. But if I take a physicalist view, there's a whole realm of explanation that comes with it and is independently verified through just the consistency and success of science speaks to the value of holding the view of physicalism. Whereas when we the question I keep getting back to is, what is consciousness? What do we mean by the term when it's not a human mind or biological mind? What does it do? How is it structured? How do we get at saying that it has a structure? Other than those are the kinds of
man. Let me just say, I am loving this conversation. These are the kind of questions, these are the kind of conversation points I love to consider, think about. And so you guys out there, if you like what you hear, please like and subscribe. We have more guests coming. We're going to talk about these things. I think it's very important. And you raise a really good point, and one that I totally agree with. And so let me backtrack. Let me go back to your first thing. So you were talking about AI, right? And AI does all the things, right? It does all the things that the human does or whatever. It talks like the human. It may even walk like a human if we embody it into a robot. The question is it conscious? How would we know it's conscious? My intuition is that they are not conscious, right? I think a lot of people share this. Even better than an AI, recently, researchers have successfully created a complete, functional, digital simulation of an adult fruit fly brain, right? And it was based on a revolutionary full brain mapping called Connectome, right? And this was published last year or 2 years ago, back in October 2024, in Nature. And this model simulates over like what, 130 something thousand or 50 million synapses to accurately predict behaviors like feeding, walking, rooming, all kinds of fly things. So when they did this thing, guess what happened? It started doing fly stuff. It started acting like a fly, not predictably, it didn't predict it. They didn't program it. It just started acting like a fruit fly, doing all the fruit fly things. Now, none of the researchers think for a minute that the fruit fly simulation is actually experiencing anything. It doesn't think that it's conscious. There's tests run. You can read all about that too. There's nothing to indicate any sort of conscious experience, which was expected, by the way, to be quite honest with you. That they thought, because the whole shaping principle of the whole experiment was, look, if all consciousness really is just the neurons firing, and all consciousness really is processing. It really doesn't matter about the substrate. What does that matter? That doesn't matter. Biology, computer bits, it's all the same. It's doing the same thing. There's no difference there, right? But to their surprise, there's actually no indication that this fruit fly thing was actually conscious, right? So they're going to be doing the same thing with humans. They're going to try to map the entire human brain onto the same, just to see what's going to happen. Now they don't expect you're going to have an experience. It's kind of like simulating a kidney and then expecting it to pee on your desk. It's not going to happen. Like, you don't create a black hole simulation and then expect it's going to suck your room. It's like there's a difference there. So I agree with you there that there's something about biology that's kind of special, right? Like the way I look at it, as far as I know about humans, we are conscious. I grant that you, Steve, are conscious, and I know I'm conscious. What do we have in common? Well, we have complex ordered structure. We're organized. We have a metabolism. We have homeostasis, growth and development. We go through all of that. Reproduction. We have a genetic code, which is like an information base. We respond to stimuli. We adapt. We evolve. We use energy. There's a boundary between the self and the environment conceptually, right? And so these sort of things show a commonality that we can sort of draw from epistemically, that I would say I would kind of defer to integrated information theory, which looks at the human brain, looks at other systems, and it says, well, wait a minute. How do we know when something is conscious? So it has a measurement called phi. And whenever you see a system, like a biological system, like a brain, you'll see where the phi increases through the complexity, the integration of all this information. And when that information is integrated, that's when you have conscious moments. And so what that theory does is it starts with consciousness as a given. It's just a fundamental aspect. They don't try to explain where consciousness from. They said, let's just skip all that. Let's just say consciousness sort of attaches itself to integrated information points. Any sort of point that's integrated enough, consciousness will express itself through it, sort of like a medium.
So it's disturbing to me that you'll let's just do this kinds of decisions. Like, let's just suppose that consciousness, whatever. Why make that move? Because it's taking a legitimate scientific, philosophical problem, and that's why you need to engage in both of those. And it shouldn't be something, I don't think, that we should just say, well, if we just take it for granted that consciousness is this and that, then it solves all those hard problems. But what I tried to open with was, okay, yeah, it can do that. Is it good to do that? Is that the right epistemic move to do that? And are we actually, like, the cost of doing that has to be outweighed by the benefit. And I don't see that we get any benefit out of just granting that. Let's start with this and see where we end up. It doesn't seem to have in the history of doing that any known benefit for starting that way.
Well, I'm going to refer to it as IIT, Integrated Information Theory.
Mhm.
This is one of the more popular or more successful theories of consciousness today, along with global workspace. IIT is really a theory of consciousness developed by this guy named Giulio Tononi. And what it tries to explain is what consciousness is and when it exists by focusing on how information is structured and integrated within a system. But to me, I'll be honest with you, I kind of agree. I don't think it really explains consciousness at all. A system, it only says that a system is consciousness to the extent that it has integrated information, right? That's what it's saying. You know, hi-fi means lots of tightly integrated, irreducible information, more consciousnness. Lo-fi is little or no integration, little or no consciousness, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the key idea is that a system is consciousness if it has many possible states, like information. And those states are unified and irreducible when they're integrated. So a human brain is highly integrated. It has a high phi, has high consciousness. A camera or like a simple circuit processes information, but it's not really integrated at all. So it has a low phi.
It seems like, at least on some level, there's a requirement for consciousness to include the idea of awareness. Otherwise, there's nothing to experience, and you're back to your problem again. And this is where I don't see that you can say that. I don't see how you can easily say that the fundamental, most basic thing out there is something that not just enables it. The physical world can enable consciousness. That's the whole claim. You can get there from A to Z just in a physical account. I just don't. Let me table that. Let me ask you a more interesting question. Mm-hmm. So, as we develop these AI data centers that are taking up so much resources, we're going to have to do something, because pattern recognition, like I said, is extremely expensive. Not just on a physical level. If you expand it out to machines and you get even trillions more kinds of transactions in a nanosecond than you can with a brain, even more expensive just to go through all the iterations of having that many things firing at once. If we develop something, and we have one mode of programming AI is a genetic model. Most of the stuff, of course, we're trying to replicate it artificially what is human intelligence. So what if one of the modes that we try to use to save GPU cycles to get a really good, appropriate enough response from AI is to stop the amount of transactions it takes to recognize different patterns and make decisions off that, and reduce it to something like an emotion. So we're taking out the idea that biology itself is a requirement, but the reason why we have emotions, which is the necessary condition of, we're going to presume that emotion is a necessary condition for the development of consciousness. So we'll just assume that you can program in something like bookmarks, like I was talking about, that act the same way as a stub for decision making, that tries to assess a lot of complex data and express it simply and put a weighted value to that experience. Here is an experience that I really loved. Do it again. That sort of thing. Or this caused me pain. Or this took me however many iterations, and that represents a cost or a penalty. However you're regulating your AI, you can it's easy to put cost consequences to every kind of decision, which could give you the possibility of, since you have something that's not purely logic, just clicking through ones and zeros, but probabilistic heuristics is the best term for it, where you're not necessarily in touch with all bits of reality. That's the whole point. But you've got a good basis to take the emotional content of that the previous experiences and infer from those whether or not that emotional content is going to be rewarded or punished.
So what is the logical link though to an experience to that? What would you say the logical, because see, here's the thing. With strong emergence, we're talking about, 0 to 100 somehow. Add as many zeros as you want. When do you get to a non-zero number? Well, if we rely on our reason and rationality and what we understand, you don't. 0 plus 0 is always 0. So how are we getting from everything you're talking about to a conscious experience?
I don't know that that's an apt analogy. You're starting with something and you're ending up with something different. That's not exactly a good way to categorize what's going on in the idea of weak emergence or strong emergence. It's just not an apt analogy. You're starting with something. The explanation has to be is how can we get to that other thing that we know exists also? We know there are rocks and those are made of atoms. And on the other end, we know there are human beings and we have this kind of appreciable, really neat thing called consciousness or conscious experience. Now, how do we account for all those? So it's not as easy to maybe explain the way that you're trying to. I think I know what you're trying to get at.
Maybe we should come to an agreement on that term first then.
Okay.
The way I understand weak emergence is the idea that higher level phenomena arise from lower level processes, but are fully determined by them, right? So even if they're hard to predict or understand, they're still fully determined. Like, a property is weakly emergent if like it comes from simpler parts interacting. There's no new fundamental substance or force added to it. So that's how I understand weak emergence. Do you agree with that?
Yeah.
You do? Okay.
Yeah. So tell me about your vision of strong emergence and what the problem is getting there. I know that you did the generalization that there's not examples and things like that. That's
right. So let's see if you agree with my understanding of strong emergence. So strong emergence is one of those things where some higher level phenomena are not fully explainable, even in principle, by their underlying parts. It may introduce like really new properties or causal powers. Okay. So the core idea with that is that a strong emergent property arises from lower level systems, but are not reducible to those systems and may have its own causal influence. Would you agree with that?
It's not so much whether or not I agree. I don't think that's an epistemic problem. What you'd have to claim that makes like super strong emergence is that not only fundamentally, take it this way, it's under chaos theory, for example. You don't have to have very many variables before the outcomes or states of affairs in the future become unpredictable. And that still doesn't rule out the necessary conclusion that it's fully determined. Like we can not violate a law of physics, but we still epistemically don't know what's going to happen. But we can hold that the determination was all the way through it, even though we couldn't predict the future. But if you look at it backwards the same way, we can have an epistemic gap that qualifies as what you just said would be a kind of strong. You can't go back because there's just too much to functionally calculate to pin it on any one set of initial conditions that kicked off the whole thing. Can't do it. That's a kind of strong emergence, but it's an epistemic. Like I think that you're wanting to go from having an epistemic gap to something I'd call like super strong emergence, which is it's not just a fundamental problem of being able to reduce in some kind of mathematics the states of affairs that preceded all the other states of affairs to a certain point back in history. I don't think that's what you mean. What you would want from a super strong sense of strong emergence is that it's ontologically impossible to go back and do that, because it's
Well,
just
I don't know the difference between a super strong emergence and just strong emergence. I'm not getting into that, but
yeah.
I'm just kind of going off what I've ever read, like with a lot of these philosophical terms. And I'll present this so that the audience can kind of see what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
This is a paper by David Chalmers. This is regarding weak and strong emergence, two concepts of emergence. I'll just kind of read it real quick. The term emergence often causes confusion in science and philosophy, as it is used to express at least two quite different concepts. We can label these concepts strong emergence and weak emergence. Both of these concepts are important, but it is vital to keep them separate. We can say that a high-level phenomena is strongly emergent with respect to a low-level domain when the high-level phenomena arises from the low-level domain, but truths concerning that phenomena are not deducible, even in principle, from truths in the low-level domain. Strong emergence is the notion of emergence that is most common in philosophical discussions of emergence, and is the notion invoked by the British emergentists of the 1920s. And he goes on, let me go down. So, well, I guess that kind of encapsulates strong emergence has much more radical consequences than weak emergence. If there are phenomena that are strongly emergent with respect to the domain of physics, then our conception of nature needs to be expanded to accommodate them. That is, if there are phenomena whose existence is not deducible from the facts about the exact distribution of particles and fields throughout space and time, along with the laws of physics, then this suggests that new fundamental laws of nature are needed to explain these phenomena. The existence of phenomena that are merely weakly emergent with respect to the domain of physics does not have such radical consequences. And so I guess that's why I'm more, of appealing to weak emergence, rather than the strong emergent story, if that makes any sense, because it seems to be more parsimonious for me.
Yeah. Well, one is certainly, you can be a lot more comfortable accepting the one because it is reducible to physical states of affairs. I always had problems with Chalmers' description exactly from the distinction that I'm trying to say, which is I don't know what he means by truths, which I don't assume that he means facts or states of affairs that are mind independent, because facts are just what they are. States of affairs just are what they are. Truth is at least a term that is epistemic, where we're trying to say, with the given information that we have, are we justified to say this implies that a proposition is true? It's not me saying it's true. That's just a property of that proposition, that sort of thing. So you've got the epistemic problems, which is, and I'm trying to make a distinction within what I'm taking strong emergence to be in one case, and then what I could take it to mean on the other. And I think that the other one, the super strong, is the one where idealism might have a chance to survive. But on weak strong emergence, the one where it's an epistemic problem. So there may in fact ontologically be a traceable set of beginning states of affairs that are all deterministically linked together, but in a way where the outcome leaves us epistemically unable to go back and trace how that all fit together. That fulfills his definition of strong emergence, but it's an epistemic problem, not an ontological one. The ontological one would be to say that there were at one point in time states of affairs that led up to certain things that happened, but those facts don't exist anymore. You can't get back down there. And you can also introduce a gap in there because we can't say whether or not there was some kind of deterministic path, then we've got this super strong emergence, and we can insert in that epistemic gap consciousness. And that always seemed to be the move that Chalmers was making.
Well, I would agree. You know, it's definitely, when you take the scientific perspective, it's underdetermined. That's exactly right. And I never claim, I would never claim that any sort of metaphysical view has been a settled question by science or anything like that. And I bring this up only here to talk about just another source. I know you say you don't really agree with a lot about Chalmers, but this is from the Plato Stanford EDU site for that, and it talks about.
I agree with what he says. I just don't understand all the time what exactly he means in his talks.
But the point here is especially here the challenges to its viability. And it talks about an initial worry about strong emergence is that there is a tension in the very idea of a feature that is both dependent and fundamental, a worry exacerbated by recent accounts of fundamentality, according to which what it is to be fundamental is precisely to be independent. This worry might be resolved by distinguishing two senses of fundamental, and it goes on with that, but it goes on to talk about really the same thing, evidential paucity, introducing new, properties to explain things. It just creates a lot of issues. I'm not saying that proves it wrong. It doesn't mean that. I would gladly do that, but I'm just saying if, we may live in a magical universe. I'm all for it. I'm all for it. It's just that I like to, when we talk about metaphysics, we want to draw on parsimony. That's a virtue. Now, it doesn't mean that reality, and I always say this again, reality is rarely as parsimonious as our theories once thought we should approach it as. Like, for example, well, you go ahead. I think I cut you off.
Yeah, let me say two things. Parsimony is great. That's kind of what I opened with, though. You've got to get something there's got to be an upshot better than just parsimony. You have to offer some kind of use for any idea, or else it's just trivial. There has to be something at stake, and accepting the idea does some work for us. And that's my problem with idealism. It doesn't do anything other than smooth out problems that are academic in nature. It doesn't tell us anything really about the world. But what I was going to suggest is we've gone for almost 2 hours, and it's just you and I having the fun. Do we want to see who's left hanging out there that has any questions and wants to join in?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just want to agree with you there too, to say that these metaphysics models aren't really you're not going to find any sort of use, like practical use, like out there, like science, is all about finding function and things of that nature. I totally agree with that.
Well, the physicalism is a metaphysical view, and it offers predictive, it gives you a bang for the buck. That's my difference between holding the one view or the other. It's not just a matter of preference. We get something out of having the idea of physicalism
as a shaping principle.
Not just shaping, it is how we conduct every branch of inquiry that has understanding reality at every scale. It comes from the basic idea of the fundamental thing being physicalism. And that's the consequences of taking that view are historically, we're here talking about AI on computers, and we're over a certain distance. It's all the success of taking that view and finding things out about the world. And these are the consequences of it. I don't see anything like that with idealism. So that's all I wanted to kind of point out there. But I am interested to see what other kinds of questions, like how people have taken our discussion and what they might be curious about asking.
Absolutely. Let me see if anyone wants to throw a question. I know Uncarved Block Question, if they do, oh, I don't know where he's picking up from. Let me go back because I want to go, I know. Question, is consciousness a fact or just a philosophical idea? What do you think, Stephen?
If a fact is the same thing as a state of affairs, consciousness is a fact.
Yeah, I would agree. Joel asks, how do we know what's explainable?
You find out by offering theories and putting them to the test. And if they work, if they make consistent predictions, have value in a way of thinking about the world in a cohesive picture, which is what we're trying to do with idealism. It's what you want out of any theory. And that's why I kind of frame this as, is it an ideal idea? Physicalism, or what kind of ideal ideas do we have? Where they're the kind that give us a cohesive picture that add understanding of the world that we didn't have before, and can do something in the future to advance our understanding farther down the road. And we don't get a lot of resistance for the way things are for having those ideas. To me, that's an ideal idea.
Yeah. Explaining, I think that explanatory power can sort of connect the dots. You know, we can sort of look at causation. You know, this thing causes that thing, so we can make predictions, so we can do all that stuff. But when we're talking about ontology and metaphysics, we're talking beyond the relations. We're talking about, you know, the core, you know, the fundamental things of life, right? Like, you know, for me, I don't think time is necessarily fundamental. Therefore, causation isn't necessarily fundamental. I think there's a lot of different modeling among physics, people who look at theoretical physics, to talk about how time really isn't what we think it is. Time may just be something else. You know, I don't want to get into it here, but in other words, it's not necessarily true or a fact that time is fundamental.
You might want to read an idealist and start with Kant and apperceptions and see if that gives you a different way of picturing what you've just said, which is interesting. So, but both of them, your conversation, his conversation, they just put you in a neat little uncomfortable position.
The problem of causation.
Well, there are certain the term, it's getting late. Apperception is a concept that we have, any one of the number of concepts that we have that are necessary for us to have in order to have any experience at all. And so let's go from Kant to Hume. Space, time, and causality are things that we cannot, they're concepts that we cannot have experiences without having those concepts. And the time and causality are related into how fundamental they are to the possibility of experiences. It's because you can have event A and event B, and we don't know any kind of causal relation without the concept of time. So if A is here, and then we always see that the pattern is correlated, when A happens and then B happens, that necessarily means you have to have some kind of concept in play to put causation together, which talks about the necessity of the concept of time. And then because we have the idea of cause and effect because of time and causality, then it seems like it applies. Can't remember exactly how Hume went about arguing it, but
Hume said we never observe causation, only constant conjunction. That's a statement I really love from him. Yeah. So he says, like you said, we see A followed by B repeatedly, but we never perceive a causal power connecting them. So causation might just be a habit of expectation, not something real in the world itself. So this is a serious problem. Because science describes regularity, not real causes. Then laws are perfect.
Yeah, this is a perfect example of something that may not actually be true about the world, but it's necessary for us to have
Yes.
experience. So we need the concept of causality because it makes sense of how we experience the world, but causality might not be any part of the world. Yet the world is so regular that even if we're wrong, we're wrong for the right reasons for having this concept of time
Right. But
and causality and all that kind of stuff. So it
the
just
piece of
maybe
that
there are
that
things that we have to have in order
well,
to have
well, the
experience.
piece of that I like when it relates to idealism is it just supports the notion that what we call the physical reality out there is an appearance, is how it appears to the mind, and so that's
That's I
part of
really
my
the problem there. Always the problem is the distinction between epistemic and ontologic.
right, right. I
So
understand that. I understand. We haven't
yeah,
gotten to there just from that, but it's where we
yeah,
start. We can start with epistemology to say that what I consider real is an appearance in our mind. We can infer, we can do science, which science is a big game of inference, and we can infer. And if we look hard enough, we realize that causation has problems, time has problems. We have like evidence to support that within our experience, like say, time dilation.
yeah.
We talk about the block universe, that time isn't real in one particular place like we think it is. It's not a static thing, but it's malleable, it's relative
Yeah.
to observers in motion and things like that. So we have time dilation, all of which supports that idea that the reality that we perceive and take for granted is just an appearance. The only thing we really know for certain is that we're having an experience of it. And we know that that appearance out there cannot, in principle, explain why we're having the perception to begin with. It's sort of like looking at a TV screen and seeing the thing in the TV and saying, "Hey, that brain in the TV that we see, that picture of the brain, that explains the screen that we're looking at." That's the problem. That's an example of the hard problem of consciousness.
What's the most interesting question that's waiting in the queue?
Yeah, let's keep going. Let's see. Da, 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 da. Would that be question? If they do, what theory of truth does each debater endorse? Okay, that's a good one.
Well, I'm a philosopher. It's complicated. If you want the short answer, let's. If you can put it together in your own head that I'm a deflationist that believes in or endorses correspondence theory, then I don't have anything else to explain. I think the idea of correspondence is another one of those things that when it just makes us able to talk about states of affairs in a convenient way. And there's got to be something in most people's mind that is true, independent of like there's a state of affairs called true between the world and what we're saying, whatever it is. I think that's a basic concept, can't be explained by anything else, but that's the goal that we strive for. In reality, it's not what justifies or warrants our use of the term true and thinking that something is true is always something other than the state of something being true. That's trivial whether it is something being true. If that made a difference epistemically, then we could just look for that property. But what gives us the right to say something is true always is epistemic, and it always comes down to the kind of warrant and justification society puts in place that a threshold is crossed, and now we can use that language and have a social public right in order to back our endorsement of some proposition. So I don't think if there is substantive truth in the world that exists independent of whether or not people existed, great. I don't care. It doesn't make any difference to me making epistemic judgments about what is true. So I don't even care about that question. So it's just language use.
Yeah, I tend to say that every theory of truth has its strengths and weaknesses. I mean, you can look at Gettier cases and sort of challenge, certain models of truth, like I guess correspondence theory, or something like you know, what the PSR or whatever. Because suppose you're walking through the park and you've got to be at a job interview at 2:00, and you look up at the clock in the park, the little park in the public park, and it says 2:00, but that clock's been broken for 10 years. And it's actually 2:00 though. And you go, so does that mean you know something? Does that mean that you knew what time it is? I mean, look, it corresponded with the actual truth that it was 2:00, but did you really know it? Did you really know the truth? That's a Gettier problem that challenges all of that. So that's its weakness. But at the other hand, it's like you said, we look for everyday ways to judge whether something is useful for us or not. So I would agree on that.
Yeah. Just got to be used to being wrong, but it's no big deal because you're right. You're wrong for the right reasons. You looked at a clock, it said 2:00, and you looked at another clock and it was fucking 2:00. What else is there?
Yeah.
What else do you need to be able to say that clock works?
Yeah.
And if you,
like I said, it's so,
you see it hasn't moved and you're like, oh shit, well, let me revise. I guess I was wrong. It's either stopped working now or it never worked.
A lot of this stuff depends on the subjective goals a person has. Yeah. And what they're asking. What questions are you trying to get an answer for? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where it's kind of boiled down. Yeah. Let me see if we have any more. Yeah, there's a good one. Yeah, has it been demonstrated that parsimony works most of the time? I think depends on who you ask. I think a lot of people, especially in who I've ever talked to. Now, I'm not an academic philosopher. I haven't debated. This is my first real philosopher that I've had a debate with. So I feel like I'm being smoked, but it's okay. I love it. But what would you say? Do you think parsimony works most of the time?
Shit, there's a lot of words that are doing a lot of work in that sentence. Works at what? Does parsimony work most of the time? If we're not saying that parsimony is warrant for believing something is true, then parsimony is part of an ideal idea. You want to have the minimal number of moving parts to explain something as possible, because like we're talking about with the possibility of being wrong, the less you commit to, the less you're going to be wrong about. So right. If you start with this with the most basic things and you're pretty sure that they're right, well, then you can go on to do something else. So parsimony is epistemic warrant doesn't do anything. But it certainly does a hell of a lot when it goes to increasing our understanding and giving us something to build from that will itself have a better chance of leading to more understanding about something. So there's one sense it could work for that, and it just can't work if parsimony is a requirement for considering something to be true. It just doesn't add up that way.
Awesome. And Joel, going back to his initial question, he said that question he had asked was in reference to the weak, strong, emergent distinction. It appealed to what's not explainable. So I guess, remember, he had asked about what does it mean for something to be explained? And I guess he was referring to the distinctions, the weak and strong emergence. How does that apply?
Okay. Gosh. Can you leave that question up there so I can read it as I talk? I don't want to drift.
Yep.
So if the question is, there's a distinction that we can make between weak and strong emergence in that there's nothing spectacular about something that weakly emerges, but there's bigger commitments in strong emergence where you don't have a path that gives you an explanation how you, from where you started to where you ended up, there's a gap. It could be an epistemic gap, which means it's just I don't have those facts accessible to me to try and put that picture back together. That's the lighter sense of what strong could mean. And this is what I haven't made sense of Chalmers on like the commitments there. And I'm sure it's clear somewhere. I also just haven't, again, I put the subject to bed.
Yeah. You left it alone for a while.
But
Yeah.
there's this other sense of super strong. Like not only is it's just those facts aren't something I can access and therefore evaluate and have things like evidence to shore up my premises to come to the conclusion I want. It's not, it's more than that. Those facts do not exist and they may never have existed. And that's where idealism comes in and says, well, the reason they didn't exist is because it was never a complete chain of physical events. On some views, I know there's non-dualism and all that kind of shit, but there's certainly one of the main views is that the reason consciousness has some kind of tie to reality, but it's not fundamentally tied to physical things. It can be, my consciousness can go on in some other plane of existence without any kind of material, whatever. But if you can't explain going from how you get to consciousness from just the primordial physical ooze that the planets and everything else come from. It may be just a complicated mess that we don't have the capacity intellectually to get at. And that's one sense that we could, we can't get.
Yeah, it's incomplete. Yeah.
Yeah. We just can't epistemically figure it out. We can make different inferences and we can try to whatever, but we don't have direct access to what caused something. Where in the weak sense of emergence, we do. We know at 5 o'clock in Los Angeles on a weekday, you're going to have fucking rush hour, and there's going to be jam-packed cars. We can trace everything about that is sufficient to explain why at 5 o'clock on a Monday you've got cars that are stacked up on top of each other.
And there's a component of non-reducibility in there you need to mention, because like maybe an example of strong emergence other than
it's the stuff in between A and B. When you're talking about reducibility, what you're trying to do is say, if I start here, I can backtrack with all kinds of facts to get to. And so what the term reducibility means is that's what you're doing. You're saying from here to here, it's just these components that make up this thing that's here. That's reducing this to all of the phenomenon that happened in between starting point and ending point. So that's what reducibility is, just in the general sense. But it may be the ontological one is you cannot reduce it because there's nothing there to reduce, because all of the stuff that's there is insufficient for consciousness. But it could be that you just can't reduce it because there's not enough information for you to.
Right. There's not enough data available to draw from. Right.
That's what I was trying to make with the distinction.
Yes, and I agree. And maybe another analogy you could use, or another example, would be quantum entanglement is considered strong emergence, because, like, remember I mentioned at the top the Bell and Leggett tests, like those experiments violate inequalities based on like local realism. And this kind of shows that the whole system's properties are not reducible to its parts, and it's considered an example of strong emergence. We don't have
there are no magic variables as far as science is concerned, but you have these two causally linked identical atoms or
Einstein hated it.
Yeah, so you can't reduce it because there's no fact. There's no that's the kind of the physics of the hard problem of entanglement.
Yeah. That's why they call it quantum fields are fundamental. And when I say fundamental, maybe for now, until we learn more. Like I don't want to.
That's what I'm saying. No, it's not. This is an ontological problem. It's not someday we will have the ability maybe to figure out why entanglement works. What I'm saying is right now we know there are no hidden variables that exist that make this work. It just works. That's what we know right now. So it's an ontological problem in the sense that there is no fact that explains these two things. Not just we don't have access to the facts. There, as far as we can do the math, there are no facts.
Absolutely.
When was there were two. I'll see just later. I'll see if I can dig up the paper that I'm drawing this information from. Interesting on the proving. The idea was, well, there are things that we just don't know, facts that we just don't know, we can't access, and that explains them. And then the scientific counter to that was, well, no, because here are all the maths, here are all the experiments that imply, not beyond math, that this is what it is. So anyway, yeah, consciousness could be something like that, where that's why it's not reducible. There is no magic variable that gets you from starting point to end point. Right. That's the way it is. Okay, well, there's dualism at least. But is it fundamental? We don't know. These are the questions.
Yeah, like dualism, like there's these panpsychists, which is really just idealism in the clothes of dualism. It's basically saying, well, you got two fundamental properties. You've got the physical and the consciousness are both fundamental, because both are sort of non-reducible if you get down to it. But I guess my problems with that is, like, when they take this atomist view, this old-fashioned, pre-20th century view of atoms, like they're these little billiard balls that, interact or whatever. And that's really not what physicists talk about when they talk about atoms and subatomic particles. They're really just fields. And these fields are non-local, which goes back to entanglement. So that's why they say, like, the quantum field is sort of a non-local fundamental sort of property that we can talk about. Mm-hmm. So if a panpsychist was to say that, well, consciousness is embedded in atoms, well, they're really saying that consciousness is embedded in the quantum field. And at which case, now you get idealism, because now everything's one. So
my question is, again, I cannot. It's the conceivability problem for idealism is this: I cannot think of consciousness outside of biological concept. So yeah. I don't know what disembodied, like, just bits of what you're calling consciousness make up the rest of everything else. I don't know what consciousness means outside of my firsthand experience. Like, I can't work out how a fuzzy term like that would work out into a structure we could talk about, and then put a theory on top of that of, because of the structure, now we have material things, physical things. And that was some of the stuff I was bringing up in the opening. It's got to earn its explanation, or its place in the pantheon of ideal ideas by offering something other than just smoothing out problems that are there. But anyway, maybe one more question. We're on about 2 hours, 15 minutes now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't want to hold you up. See, me, the difference is I could mistakenly stay up all night and not get anything done tomorrow by having this conversation.
Me too. And I appreciate it. It's been great.
It's been a lot of fun, man. I appreciate you so much for coming on and challenging me and giving me so much to think about and having to go back and research. And I really appreciate that. You've really done me a great service, and hopefully the audience too. Hopefully you guys really enjoyed the conversation. And if you're new here, whatever, please join the team, man. Join the team. Come on and engage in the conversation. Every Saturday at 12 noon, we have these open forums where we all get on the stage and we have these debates and conversations just like this for a whole long time. And thank you, Logan at the Uncarved Block, for introducing me to Stephen. He's such a wonderful person, and he's very measured, well thought out, really great, man, a really great guest. I really appreciate all of it. I don't think we have any more questions, and I don't want to hold you up, Steve. I just want to thank you so much for having this stuff discussed with me. And yeah, sometimes spicier on Saturdays. Yeah. We get very spicy.
Yeah. I want to do those now since we've been introduced, so I appreciate those too.
And if you have time on a Saturday, please pop in, man. Join the group and offer your thoughts and stuff, man. You're like a valuable resource, man.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I've certainly enjoyed the opportunity to not only meet you, but have take a part in this kind of discussion again. It's been a while, and I've missed those. So thank you for that chance.
No problem. Well, I'm going to go ahead and sign on off, man. I appreciate everybody for showing up. Thank you so much. And until next time, guys, we'll see you on Saturday.